Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Check21 Blockbuster Story, where we have the authors of the book, Phyllis Meyerson, David Walker, and in the last episode, we were talking about what it was like in the early days of checks, or before at least Check21, and what was happening, and how there was such a need and a growing need. Some of the early stories with like Alan Slater, what happened, the Blockbuster story that it led to become, getting even, the Fed involved. And then what was happening around 9/11. And I believe one of the next things we were going to discuss was something about a colonel that got involved with this too.
Yeah. While the Federal Reserve Board staff in D.C. was making sure the country didn't totally crater our economy, the Federal Reserve Product Office in Atlanta was trying to figure out how to get those checks back in the air. And Julius Wyman of the Federal Reserve was in charge of the transportation system at the Fed. It was called Check Relay. And he diligently went around trying to find the right person to allow the checks to fly. He eventually found an Air Force colonel who would at least listen to him. That was the first part. And the colonel very nicely explained to Julius that they were in the middle of a national emergency, and the only airplanes flying was for military and medical purposes. And Julius explained that if we don't get the checks in the air, then the economy is going to crater. And so he managed to convince the colonel that they should fly the checks. And the deal they cut, Julius and the Air Force colonel cut a deal that Julius had to report to the colonel the numbers, those tail numbers on the back of an airplane. Every airplane has its unique number. And Julius would call and report the numbers to the colonel, and then the planes could take off. And as we wrote in the book, you just hope that some pilot recognizes those numbers and doesn't shoot your plane out of the air. And so we've got, it probably didn't go on very long, but Julius was the point person. And so he would call the colonel and give him the tail numbers. And I don't know, for those of you who knew Fred Herr, who passed away a good number of years ago, Fred was in charge. Fred was the senior vice president. Everybody knew Fred. Fred had a tremendous amount of power in the Federal Reserve. And one time, Julius wasn't available, so Fred picked up the phone and tried to call the colonel, and the colonel said no. The only person he would take the numbers from was Julius. And as we say, Fred, in his normal good humor, liked to laugh about the fact that Julius had more power with the colonel and the Air Force than he did. And anybody in an operational problem knows you deal with one person. It makes things complicated if you have to deal with more.
It does. And that is a great story. Now, here's my next question is, you've had a lot of important people that have been involved in this process. I mean, we're talking the head of the Fed a couple of times has been involved in this that you discussed with me. And now we had a colonel. Who's actually the highest ranking person that you were able to get to or have conversations with, or maybe even be in the room with when it came to making Check21 a reality?
David was in the White House.
The president, George Bush.
President George Bush.
Yeah, at the end of this story, I actually got to participate in what they call the executive signing, presidential signing of the Check21 Act in the Oval Office in the White House with Bush and some others.
So you went to the White House and met President Bush so that we now have Check21, which is really just the ability to take a picture of our check so it can get deposited.
Well,
you
know we're going to pick on you if you don't get it exactly right. Check21 did one thing and one thing only. It allowed you to take a picture of an original check and create a substitute check or an image replacement document that was the legal equivalent of the original check. That's all it did. In terms of the moving the stuff electronically, the remote deposit that you do with your phones, it did none of that. It just allowed you to take the picture and create another piece of paper that was the legal equivalent. And we're...
Okay, so everybody out there studying for an NCP, we'll get to that in a second too. You make sure you take note of that because you got to know the little nuances of things.
We've got a whole thing. Now, if you remember my speeches, I don't think you were around during Check21. I had a whole list of myths. Everybody and their grandmother got it wrong.
Now, we need to make a connection, though, here, because Phyllis has talked about converting a piece of paper to another piece of paper, which is all Check21 did. But what it did is that with that environment, it allowed a bank in Hawaii, I'll give you that example, in Hawaii, to take a picture of the check and transmit that picture to a location, if not the bank, that the check where the check is drawn. For instance, New York, Puerto Rico, someplace on the East Coast. So you needed the electronic piece to make, or that's what made the economics work of this, because now you can physically take out the transportation element. You take out the planes, you take out the trucks. You can transmit this thing as long as you can reproduce this new piece of paper that looked like the old piece of paper. So it didn't tell you could do that, but the law allowed you to recreate the new piece of paper from the old one, and electronics are just used.
And then in that, what made the substitute check when you actually print out what was received? That's the substitute check.
That's
that's correct.
That is, according to the law, the substitute check is the legal equivalent that could be used for all purposes as if it was the original check. And I know your audience is going to just dive right into the book and read the chapter on the standard, on how we develop that standard.
Wait. Standard. So you're telling me now that if we're going to be taking things and doing that truncation process, imaging things, having the substitute check, do we need some rules or maybe even an organization that can create rules and oversee some of this to make it all happen?
The standard is different. The standard created what that piece of paper looks like. For those of you who have seen it, there's this stuff on the left side. But the rules were needed in order to do image exchange. And I know you're going to what ECHO was. And ECHO was developed in 1990. David was already there. I came on the following year. We were developing rules for, at that time, it was called ECP with paper to follow. So we were transmitting the mica line, and then the physical piece of paper was continuing to move by the planes. And so ECHO wrote.
Wait, Phyllis, tell me who ECHO is.
ECHO is the Electronic Check Clearinghouse Organization. And the idea came about in a bar in 1990 by a number of float people who were trying to figure out how to kind of deal with the new Reg CC based on the Expedited Funds Availability Act. And so we started out just writing the rules for what they called ECP with paper to follow at the time, which was still moving the paper around. And it was a pretty easy jump to say, let's go to image, once we were able to write the rules for image.
Hey, David, I just got to say and clarify real quick for people that heard her say float people in a bar. Float people are not people who had too much to drink in the bar. These are people that are talking about the time it takes to actually settle a check and the floating of the money in between all of that. Just in case you heard that. You did hear right. She said float.
Yeah, I'm not sure float managers exist much anymore.
Yeah, Phyllis and Kevin, let me give a little bit more explanation on why all this occurred. We've talked about there being 6 different time zones across the U.S. And what those time zone differences create, at least back in the 90s and earlier, was a huge advantage for the East Coast banks relative to the West Coast banks. Because there's a 3-hour differential between the East Coast and West Coast, forgetting Hawaii and Puerto Rico for a moment. The 3-hour time differential and a 6-hour flight differential. But between the two, you got a 9-hour differential plus transportation on either end of that. Because of that, the West Coast banks are always looking for a way to improve the check collection process, so they could offset the advantage that the East Coast banks had. One of the West Coast bankers that happened to be in that bar at a BAI conference was Wynn Lewis. Wynn came up with this crazy idea that, gee, these computers are capturing this information about the check electronically anyway. What if they transmitted that file to the East Coast bank, but they continued to also ship the paper? The electronic file would be there in time for processing hours earlier than the paper would. And then they could have processed the paper when it arrived later and do the comparisons before it goes out. So it proved to be a way to reduce the advantage that the East Coast banks had, and that was beneficial to the West Coast banks. There's also benefits to the bank that was actually able to post all these extra dollars a day earlier on the East Coast than they would have been otherwise. So they had advantages as well. But this is the start of this electronic process, actually, was this transmission. And Echo wasn't the first one to actually be involved in this. There were a couple of banks earlier that we won't go into here, but this was the first big effort with that. And you ask who Echo was. Echo was formed by initially by 10 large banks in the U.S. Later, across the years, membership of Echo expanded to closer to 4,000 financial institutions, and it included not just the big banks, but community banks, mid-tier banks, bankers banks, credit unions, corporate credit unions. The smallest member that we had at that point was credit union that only had $50 million in deposits. 50 million, not billions, $50 million. So we had the tiniest little financial institutions in the U.S., as well as the very largest institutions. And that put
and you were basically creating rules and supporting, when it came to electronifying checks or using Check21, you were there to be able to make that happen and help people to make that happen. That was what Echo's purpose really was, right?
That's correct. And because we had the big banks, we had the financials to be able to develop the rules. But the rules aren't really all that effective unless you can have large numbers of institutions participating in the rule. And so with all those banks involved, we were able to have pretty much universal rules for the collection initially of ECP transactions. And then later, Echo adopted image exchange rules. Well,
and if anybody's wondering, this is what we talk about when we're talking Echo rules. This is something very near and dear to me that I have had to spend part of my life having to really learn. But we'll get to that in a second. And doing all this, what I want to get to too is Check21. We've given all this history of how it came about, what was happening, how it helped to level the playing field from East Coast to West Coast. But when Check21 actually passed, it got signed in, it becomes a law, and you can now have this substitute check or sending things electronically. What happened in the industry then? I mean, what was the result of this becoming a law? What really happened at that time?
Well, David needs to go back a little bit, how we got it passed.
Yeah, I think we need to do a little prep work before you get there, because you made a huge leap in this transition. So so Greenspan sent this proposal over to Congress at the end of 2001. And a few months after that, Tom Fox, who is an attorney for Echo, Tom and I went to visit the House Financial Services Committee in D.C. To see what was happening with this proposal that the Fed made. Well, I said earlier that this was historic and that the Fed had never proposed legislation. It's also important to understand that the Fed also doesn't lobby Congress. Now, as far as I know, they don't have a legal restriction doing that. There are plenty of other organizations that can't lobby because they're funded by the government, but the Fed is not. But the Fed by policy, even if the law doesn't apply to them, the Fed by policy does not lobby Congress. They testify a lot, but they don't actually go lobby for the congressman to pass particular bills. So Tom and I show up a few months after this has arrived over at the Congress. And we discover in talking with the House Financial Services that this bill's not going anywhere. They say there's no support for the bill, and therefore no action will be taken.
But this is pre-9/11, right?
9/11. No. This is January of 2000.
Even after 9/11, there were people saying it's not going to go anywhere?
Well, Well, see, you had 9/11, and Greenspan then the same year, later in the year, submitted this proposal to Congress. So that was the sequence, and then after that, they don't fully understand the implications of this. But even if it's important, you still have to have support, and they didn't see any support from the industry or anybody else. Now, the good news out of the process was that they also didn't see any real opposition. And so Tom and I told them that, well, there actually is a good bit of support. You just haven't heard about it yet. And so we're going to come back to you later with good examples of that support. And so, and Tom and I then went off and started talking with all the various banking trade associations in DC that have lobbyists. This is what they do all the time. ECHO is not a lobbying organization. So we went around and talked to all these various bank trade associations, and we asked them, is this a law that you're interested in? They said, yes. All said yes. We asked if they would be supportive of the law. They said, yes, they would. We asked if they would be willing to lead an industry effort to get this thing passed through Congress. And they all said no.
And wait. They said yes, yes, yes. And then when you get to the point of leading an effort to get it through Congress, no, we're not going there.
Yeah. That's right. They said no. Now, the reason why they said no is because while they were interested and supported it, it was pretty low on their overall agenda, legislative agenda. They had things that they were working on for some time, and they thought those were more important than this. So, yeah, they'd support it, but it wasn't going to get jacked up on their priority list. And so, as a result, after hearing that, I went back to the ECHO board of directors. I was the CEO of ECHO at the time. I went back to the board of directors and reported to them what we had learned. And Tom and I proposed, that we should go back, if the board approves, we should go back to all those trade associations and ask if they would support ECHO leading the industry effort to get this thing through Congress. The board agreed. They approved that. And so we went back around all the trades another time to ask them, well, okay, you said you were interested, but you wouldn't lead it. Would you support us coordinating the industry's efforts to get this thing through Congress? And they all said, surprisingly, yes. And so we started meeting.
That sounds like one of those, we're not going to do it ourselves, but we're okay if you go do it type situations. And it sounds like, too, with ECHO being the people who are closest to this and the professionals that you are, I believe you were the ones in the best position to do it anyway.
Well, as it turns out, Kevin, we were probably the only ones in a position to do it. We'd not been involved in these kinds of activities before, so we were very much naive about lobbying activities in DC. And all of these different banking trade associations, they all have some common interests and some common goals, but they also have some really big differences in some cases, or at least they have differences that they make into a big deal between them, as the case might be. So had any one of them, in fact, said, yeah, we'll be willing to lead the effort, many of the others probably would not have been willing to work with them on that because they're always competing with each other in their legislative activities. And so it was very fortuitous that they said they wouldn't do it and that they were agreeable to ECHO doing it. So
I got to know, too. I'm jumping ahead again a little bit, sure. But, and people got to read the book for these stories, but I got to know, did any of them come back to you after you got to meet the president on this and going, I wish I'd have been more involved and got to meet the president myself?
Not exactly, but there's a close, because there was only certain CEOs invited to the presidential signing. One of the trades managed to get one of the CEOs involved, even though he wasn't on the original distribution list. But no, they didn't exactly, I think they were glad somebody else was going to do it.
I think mostly they were pleased that it got done and it was going to be beneficial for the industry as well as their segments of the industry. And so they were appreciative of that effort. we tell stories in there about how the lobbyists felt about this process as they were working.
Yeah. And we had, and the group was amazing. That we called it the group. NCR was so excited about being part of the group that they actually put it in one of their marketing things. There was, bankers and the trades and some corporations like NCR, and there was 140 individuals representing, what's that number? 60 different 140 individuals representing about 60 companies, and they would literally meet on a dime. Something would happen and they pile into somebody's conference room, or they get on the phone to figure out what was happening. But they were giddy. There's rarely that they get to, the lobbyists rarely get to go up on the Hill and they're not fighting with each other. Okay, so they were like giddy that they were like, oh, good, everybody's in favor of this bill.
I just love that, here's some payments related stuff to get giddy over, because people tell me you get too excited about this stuff. And I want you to know I learned it from others. These are the people I learned a lot of why I am the way I am now and know what I know now. So these have been incredible stories. Where do we go next? Because I'm dying to get to what actually happens when Check 21 gets released.
To get to Check 21, it passed in the House 405-0, and it passed in the Senate unanimous consent. And one story I love is one of the House representatives wasn't there that day, and he came in the next day, got on the House floor and said, I wasn't here yesterday, but if I had been here, I would have voted for it. Okay, today, not talking politics, but today, they can't agree on the day of the week.
No kidding. So that is a huge testament to show that, because I'm going to go ahead and say it too. I don't think a lot of Congress people understand the world of electronic payments as it is anyway.
No.
And so to see that they would be that agreeable to making something happen, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, today they would vote against it just for the benefit of voting against it.
Somebody would just to say I voted against it.
Yeah, well, Phyllis, as usual, jumped ahead again and skipped over a couple of important steps here.
Well, it's okay, because, David, we do want people to read the book. We don't want them to get everything here. We want people to go make those donations, read the book, go to the website, and make sure they're downloading it and getting it, too.
Well, we're telling lots of stories, but we're also leaving out a lot of detail because we're just hitting the highlights of this. But to get this thing passed, you had to go through multiple hearings for the House and for the Senate. And there were several of us that testified through that process as well. I testified before the House Financial Services Subcommittee in the House. Our chairman of ECHO at the time, Grant Cole, also testified before a second hearing. I think his was in the House, not the Senate. And there were also testimonies in the Senate by one of our members as well. And so we had to go through that whole process of actually going to D.C. and testifying to get the extra support there that we needed to get this through. Ferguson, Vice Chair Ferguson, testified in every one of these as well. So he was always there. And in the book, we've got copies of all those various testimonies for people to read. But he had to do that in order to get it passed. So then we got it passed.
Okay. And it got passed. I mean, we're not going to talk about how long it took. We'll talk about how long it took to get to full electronics. But when Greenspan sent it to Congress in December of 2001, and Bush signed it October 28th, 2003, that is incredibly fast. Because people will tell you they've got bills that take decades to get passed.
Well, Phyllis, I think that really kind of leads us up to the presidential signing ceremony. So you asked earlier, Kevin, about who was the highest person that we dealt with. Yeah. Excuse me. In addition to dealing with the House and the Senate and all those folks, I had the opportunity. I was invited, along with several others, to participate in the executive signing in the Oval Office at the White House. It was a relatively small ceremony. Bush wasn't initially inclined to even have a signing ceremony, but for some reason, somebody convinced him that he should actually do this, so he did. He had 4 representatives from the House. He had 4 senators that were included, and he had 4 what they call industry representatives. 4 CEOs. 2 CEOs were from banks, one a savings bank and one a mid-sized bank. Also had the CEO of NCR, Mark Hurd, and then I was invited as the CEO of Echo at the time. And so with those invitations, I got the invitation and the place I was supposed to show up, and so I showed up at the northwest gate at the White House at the appointed time and went through the guard station there, and I tell the book details on all those.
So wait, you show up at the White House to tell them, hey, I'm going to see the president and I'm from Echo, and they go, sure, go ahead. The guards are like, yeah, we know Echo.
No, I skipped over the details. You have to be on the approved list.
Did you ever think that you would be meeting the president over this when you started Echo, when you started off your career, as you're going through all this process, as you're meeting with the board and getting them to say, yeah, go see if they'll let you be the representation? Did you ever think it would get that high?
Well, I knew if we got it approved, the president would have to sign it. Did I think I would be involved? No, it had not occurred to me that I would be involved. And in the book, we won't go into it here, Kevin, but in the book, I described the phone calls that I got and the messages and things inviting me to come and so forth. And so
that's a great story. You guys have got to go read, because I know that one
of the things we do say in the book, and to this day, we're still very annoyed of it. They did not invite anybody from the Fed. That was a travesty. I mean, we would have liked Louise to have been invited, but forget about that. Greenspan is a CEO. He is the one who presented it. We think there was a lot of politics that nobody told us about, but the bottom line was they weren't invited. Now, I'm going to give you you can cut it out if you want, but I'm going to give you a word of advice. If you have an accident, like you get hit by a car, like I do on my bike on a regular basis, there's 2 things you have to know: your name and the president's name. I had a bike accident back in May. I knew my name, but guess who I said the president was? Bush, because all I had been doing was reading the book over and over and over again at that point. They asked.
All right, well, I'm going to stop you there, and I'm leaving that in. You do need to know your name. You do need to know that it was President Bush. We have gone through, and now we're only on episode 2, and we have gone through and discussed the history of how we got to electronic checks and how we finally have got the president to sign it into law. In episode 3, we're going to have to go into what happens after it's signed into law and what is the future of checks going to really look like after it's been signed into law. But once again, David, where do people get this book? Those who've been listening, where can they go get and download this book?
Well, they can get the book from my website, tillerendeavors.com. That's TILLERENDEAVORS. It's pearl.com. And they'll find it there on the web, on the front, the homepage of the website. But Kevin, I have to tell you that, again, you've kind of skipped ahead to the president signing this. And we haven't talked about how that actually occurred. And I think your readers will find that interesting as well. So we should pick up with that for the next episode.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I know my name is Kevin Olson, also known as the Payments Professor. And if you need to get a hold of me, it's Kevin at paymentsprofessor.com. But for now, I got to say, class dismissed.